Thank you for joining today's webinar on financial economics and the management of public pension plans, a critical response. Today's program is part of NCPERS Center for Online Learning. The purpose of the Center for Online Learning is to provide remote continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. In the typically sedate, demure, and sometimes downright boring world of public pension management, there has been a raging debate about what is the proper method to determine public plan obligations. For those who argue that public pensions should use financial economic models and methodologies are generally opposed to the established principles in the public pension community of using expected returns as the discount rate and using level cost of projected benefits to determine the cost of the plan. To shed light rather than heat on this very lively topic, we have Mr. Paul Angelo, Senior Vice President and Actuary with Siegel Consulting, and Ms. Sherry Chan, Chief Actuary for New York City. They will lead us in today's webinar on financial economics and the management of public pensions. As always, we encourage questions and comments. However, in order to get through the presentation, we will hold all questions and comments till the end. The prepared portion of the presentation will last approximately 50 minutes. Additionally, today's presentation and other supporting materials are available in the handout section of the dashboard. Paul, Sherry, the presentation is yours.
Okay, thank you, Hank, and hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. And Sherry, it's good to be working with you again. We do want to thank NCPERS for giving us the opportunity to present this material. As Hank mentioned, there is an ongoing controversy on how to value pension obligations for public sector plans. Ongoing meaning now about 10 years we've been raging this discussion. This presentation, I got to tell you, was originally designed for an actuarial presentation, so it's a little bit technical. We will try as we go through to highlight some of the sort of the top level concepts. But one of the things that's difficult about this debate is that it's really hard to boil it down into soundbite. And of course, with the attention span of the typical newsreader these days, that can be a challenge. But just to give you the framework, generally speaking, there are two ways to assign a value and a cost to a pension promise. And we're going to call them generally something called the level cost model and something called a market pricing model. Now, it's a two. Each to determine one of these models, you have to decide two things. You got to pick a discount rate, and you got to pick what's called a cost method or an allocation method. Well, the level cost model, which as Frank said in his introduction, this is what public pensions generally use to determine their actuarially determined contribution rate. The discount rate is simply what you think the assets are going to earn, the expected return on assets. And the cost method doesn't look at the benefit earned to date, it looks at the projected benefit and calculates a level amount to produce those projected benefits. So it's a expected return discount rate and a level cost method. And this is based on established funding practices. Now, there's been a lot of work done to refine this model recently, and there's a reference paper. This is available to you. It's on your it's on your GoToMeeting page there over on the side. It's called the white paper. You can also see a link to it on slide 25 of this deck. And that really talks about how to do this level cost method, things like asset smoothing and how to amortize your unfunded liabilities. So that's the level cost model. In contrast, the market pricing model, which is the one that is based upon financial economics, it has a couple of names. It used to be called the MVL, market value liability. That's kind of a funny term because it's not really the liability, but you'll hear it called the economic value. Well, the geeky name that we're going to use for it in these slides is called the MVABO. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, the discount rate, instead of using the expected return on your assets, the discount rate is basically the current market rates of return, market interest rates on low-risk bonds. That's where the MV comes from, because it's a market value, because it's based on the current market pricing of bonds. You'll sometimes hear that called the risk-free rate. And then the cost method, instead of looking at projected benefits and doing a level cost, it just looks at the amount of benefit the member has earned today. What's the value of the benefits earned to date based on today's service and today's salaries? Well, that's called the ABO. What does that mean? That's the accrued benefit obligation. So the term of art here is this MVABO. You can think of it as the MVL if you're familiar with this debate. That basically is what the financial economists, the value that they would assign based on a market price of the benefits earned to date. Now, if you want to review all of that, and actually everything we're going to be talking about today, there is a paper that was republished last year in the Society of Actuaries, one of their journals. That is also, there's a link to that on slide 25, and that document's also available in the little dashboard on the side of your screen. Now, there's a lot of this confusing terminology here, and the terminology is sometimes used to advance arguments in kind of a sneaky way. You know, we throw around the word cost, liability, obligation, and value. All of these terms have different meanings. So when I use the word cost, I think of it first as sort of with a lowercase c. And that's just the general idea of a cost versus benefit. You know, if you're going to provide something of value to the people that work for the taxpayers, somebody has to come up with, you know, with resources to pay that. So it's the hurt on the taxpayer to provide retirement security to the employees. That's a lowercase cost. That's not a number, that's a concept. Once you try to put a number on it, then cost means the quantified amount of cost that's incurred in a particular period. And the idea is that if you actually fund that cost each year, you'll get the benefit paid for. Once you assign a cost to each year, you can ask yourself, well, what are the costs that have been accrued so far? Well, those accrued costs, that's what we call a liability. And you can see one determines the other. If you know the cost each year, you can add them up to get the liability. If you know the liability each year, you can take the change in liability, that'll be your cost. Okay, so far. Now, this obligation, we already saw that when we referred to the market value numbers, the accrued benefit obligation. Obligation tends to be more of a snapshot number, which is the promise to date. Now, depending on whose model you're using, that might be the same as the liability, and you can see that's why this gets tricky. And then another funny one is the word value. I've had that thrown at me. You know, this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. The members value their benefits, right? They like having them. When an actuary values a benefit, he puts a number on it. Those are not the same thing, but they use the same word. The reason I'm beaten on this is because one of the things that the proponents of the market pricing model, that the financial economists do, they assert that the cost is the cost that's determined under their model. They kind of call it, they actually refer to it as the one true cost. And the way they do that is they start with their measure of liability, which I call the MVABO, but they call them market value liability. They say that is the liability. And then they take the change in that each year. That little triangle is math speak for delta being changed. So the change in their measure of liability is the cost each year. And they say that's all determined by the market. In contrast, when we build the level cost model, and you'll see this in that white paper, we start off by allocating a cost to each year of service. That's what we call the normal cost. If you're a pension trustee, you've heard your actuaries talk about the normal cost, which is the value that is assigned to each year of service. And then you simply add up those normal costs with interest, and that gets you your accrued liability. So the question is, which of these is the appropriate measure to use? Well, you know, the actuaries work under things called the actuarial standards of practice, and they're called ASOPs. There's two of those that matter. One is ASOP number 4, and one is ASOP 27. We'll go through this in a little bit of detail in a couple slides in, but basically they say that the basis of the measurement, which measure you use, depends on the purpose of the measurement. And by the way, that's your first takeaway concept, that the purpose of the measurement determines which measure you should use. Now, a little bit more on scope. In this debate between the market pricing model and the level cost model, the proponents of the market pricing model, the financial economists, most of the discussion since 2007 has been whether public plans should disclose a market price type of measure, should disclose an MVL. And it hasn't really said you need to run the plan on that basis, determine your contributions on that basis. But if you really look into financial economic theory, there are three possible levels of application that they could insist on for their model. The first one is just disclosure. The next one is that even if you're invested in risky assets, that you should still fund based on a risk-free discount rate. Now, there's a world of difference between those two. It's one thing just to publish a financial economic type of number. It's another thing to actually increase your contributions to fund according to that model. And then the third one is the purest of the financial economics folks say you should not even be investing in risky assets. You should only invest in bonds. You may have heard of liability-driven investing, which is very common among corporate plans. That's what they're saying you should do here for public plans. That's what those proponents would say. Well, then the part that gets tricky is, just exactly at any point in time, what exactly are the financial economists lobbying for? Well, as I said, starting back 10 years ago, they were really only arguing for disclosure of this market value liability type of number. But just in last year, 2016, there was a webcast with a couple fairly well-known financial economists. And what they say is financial economics basically implies the whole bundle, that you should fund the normal costs using their methods. You should also, your investment should be matched to liabilities. And of course, then you should report your liabilities using their model. So as I said a moment ago, it's not always clear whether a particular advocate of the market pricing model, are they really saying that you should fund on a financial economics basis, even if you're not investing on that basis? Because see, the thing about in the box, if you're investing all in bonds, well then your expected return is going to be the return on those bonds, which means then your discount rate, even under our model, your discount rate would be that lower risk-free rate. So the open question is, if you're doing what most public sector funds do, which is to invest in equities and bonds, should you still use the lower discount rate and the higher cost? Our impression is that they're now saying yes. They didn't used to, but they're now saying that even if you're not investing according to their model, you should still be doing your funding calculations according to their model. That has huge public policy implications in terms of the actual year-to-year costs to fund these plans. Well, what do the standards of practice say? I alluded to this a moment ago. They stress the purpose of the measurement, and I've cited the two ASOPs here, which you're welcome to look up online if you want to. Oh, I apologize. The police are coming. This is the financial economics guys coming to arrest me. I have sirens going by my window. I'll let them go by in a second here. So under ASOP 4, which talks about how to measure the obligations, they say when you're measuring pension obligations or determining periodic costs, you look to the purpose of the measurement. ASOP 27, which talks about economic assumptions, including the discount rate, comes right out and says that the purpose of the measurement is a primary factor in selecting a discount rate. Okay, now we're going to go into the weeds a little bit here. In these two standards of practice, they talk about things like a market consistent measure and market value assessments. Those are just like the MVABO we've been talking about. Those are the financial economic measures. What they say is that those are not only a type of measure, but a purpose of the measurement. Now that may sound like a subtle distinction, but you distinguish between the tool and the task. Right? If you've got a hammer and a saw, you don't know which tool to use. Well, it depends. Are you trying to cut some 2x4s into pieces, or are you trying to push a nail into a piece of wood? So which tool you use depends upon the task. The thing about this market consistent measure is that it is not just a way to measure liabilities. It is a purpose, Well, what does that mean? What is the purpose of this defining, what's the defining purpose of this MVABO, this financial economic measure? And by the way, this is actually the core of this particular talk. As instead of sort of debating which one should be used for funding, we want to go back to the basics and talk about why did they come up with this number in the first place? Well, who are these financial economists? Well, financial economics, which we'll call FE, is the economics of financial markets. And this is another little terminology trap. Whenever you see the word financial, it basically means market. So financial economics is not a broad term. It is specifically market economics. So when a financial economics proponent says, in quotes, economic value, what they really mean is the financial economic value, which is the market replacement value, whether it's actual or theoretical. And so, in effect, this is a tricky term. You could say, if you ask a plan member, what is the economic value of your pension benefit, they're not going to calculate a number. They're going to say, well, the economic value is whatever I can buy with it. So here again, the term economic value is a general number, whereas financial economic value is very specifically their number. So it gets kind of circular. What do financial economists do for a living? They develop models that help them understand, reproduce, and predict the market pricing of traded securities. And this is a perfectly legitimate profession. You know, if you're in the business of trying to understand how stock prices work, what you do is you develop a financial model that has all the things that will determine a stock price. Well, suppose you're trying to model the stock price of a publicly traded corporation, and that corporation sponsors a pension plan. Okay, well then, if you're going to build your financial model to try to reproduce how the stock is priced, you need a number to plug into your model to represent the pension plan. That's what this MVABO, what this MVL was initially designed to do. It had nothing to do with public sector plans originally. It was about corporations. And if you're trying to understand how a pension plan sponsored by a corporation affects the stock price, this is the number that will be consistent with the other numbers in your model. So I bolded that here. The sole defining purpose of this financial economic measure is to represent a pension plan in a model of the stock price of the sponsor of that plan. So all that we know for sure about this MVABO is that it is, and I'm willing to agree that they got this right. It's the appropriate representation of a defined benefit plan in a financial economic model for of the sponsor. Well, but what's it got to do with us? Now, I have here a little history of how we got here. I'm going to just say very briefly on this slide. Originally, even corporations valued their pensions according to the level cost model, and it's really only in 2006 that the law was changed to say that that corporations should use the financial economic model when they're valuing their pensions. So even while I'm willing to agree that that's the appropriate way for corporations to do this, even that is a relatively new development. Well, the thing we get asked all the time is, okay, if this financial economic value, this MVL, if that's the appropriate number to use for a corporation, why isn't it also appropriate to use for a public pension plan? What's different about public pension plans that they should use a level cost model, even though everybody seems to agree that corporations should use the market pricing model? Well, it's all about what the financial economic model is intended to do. It's intended to reproduce market prices. That's appropriate for corporations because, after all, a stock corporation exists for only one reason, and that is to maximize the market price of the company's stock. And that means everything about the operation of a stock corporation, including its pension plans, has to somehow be reducible to a market consistent measure. And so they developed this model to have a market consistent measure for the pension plan to go along with everything else, because all the stock corporation really cares about is market pricing. Well, what about public sector plan sponsors, corporations, cities, counties, and states? Well, the public sector certainly has some linkage to the market, but it's not as direct. You know, the public sector agencies and the pension plans, they participate in the market, but the state of Ohio does not have a common stock. And so the purpose of the state of Ohio is not to maximize the current stock price of the common stock of the state of Ohio. I'm saying that a little bit tongue in cheek. It should be obvious, I think. So public sector agencies have a lot of purposes toward their operation that are not simply tied to a single market-defined measure. I like to say, just as a soundbite, corporations are of the market. It's how they're defined. Whereas public agencies and public sector pension plans are only in the market. But there are other policy considerations that are not market linked that drive the operation of public agencies, and those do not drive the operation of publicly traded corporations. So the main shortfall of the financial economic principles is that they do not include this difference. What that means is basically the financial economics conclusions, they provide information, but they're information about stock corporations. They are not information about all pension plans. Now I'm going to segue to Sherry because we're now going to look at, by the way, just because the financial economic model was developed for stock corporations doesn't necessarily mean it might not also work for public sector pension plans. So what we're now going to do is evaluate their model, look at the two components, the discount rate and the cost measure, and see how they work when you apply them in a public pension context. And so I'm going to hand control over to Sherry so she can talk about those two aspects.
Thank you, Paul. From here on the East Coast, I just want to wish everybody a good afternoon or good morning, also depending on where you are in the country. And Paul gave a great overview. So now we're going to road test this market pricing theory and measure it and see how, in terms of measuring it, the ongoing cost of a public pension plan. And we're going to focus on 2 points here. The first point is going to be the cost allocation method. And the second point that I'll get into later is the discount rate. So to start, cost allocation or funding method, it's all the same. A funding method, to just kind of lay the groundwork, is very, in a nutshell, how are you funding? It's a method of how you fund your liabilities over time. What portion of it are you attributing to the past? What portion are you contributing to the current and the future? And Paul gave a little overview of the traditional unit credit, or the TUC, and he talked about the piece about the accrued liability and the normal cost. The accrued liability you can think of as the piece that's attributed to the past, and it's the present value of the benefits that have been accrued. And normal cost is the cost that's assigned on a yearly basis, on an annual basis, and that's represented by the change in the present value of these benefits that are accrued from year to year. And there's known flaws to the traditional unit credit method, or the TUC, and because of the nature of the method. If you think first of public plans, most of the benefit formula is a percentage of final average salary. And because it is a percentage of final average salary, the final salary usually is the piece, the part of the career where people's pay is the largest, and so that therefore the cost is largest then. And if you fund the liability, the normal cost piece, the year-by-year piece that you're putting into the pension plan through the contributions, if that piece represents the piece that is growing from each year, from the past year to the present, then naturally you would understand that the piece towards the end of one's career is going to be most costly, and so it's backloaded. Another flaw in TUC is that because it represents the piece that changes from year to year, you can think of the year where a participant is partially eligible for retirement or not even eligible for retirement, and then jumps to the very next year that he or she is fully eligible. All that cost is assigned to that 1 year, and so it does spike at the year when they become eligible for retirement. A third point is that the normal cost, because it does grow over time for a single person, the total normal cost for the group is just the sum of the individual normal cost. And if you have a stable population where the average age and the average salary is the same year after year, then you're okay. But most of the time, the demographics does change from year to year. And if it does, then you no longer have a stable normal cost. You start to see the volatility and how it could fluctuate from year to year. And you can think of this, an example of this would be, you think about the Great Recession, and a lot of organizations at that time were implementing a hiring freeze because of it. And if you're not hiring people in, obviously the population is growing older each year, and that would move the normal cost and shift it. And, again, you're going to see volatility in this normal cost. And, the fourth point on here is that for the corporate side, TUC was actually illegal before the Pension Protection Act in 2006. So it goes to show that, it does have some flaws. So for the visual learners, Paul, if you can shift to the next slide, this might drive home some of the points that I was making. And on the red line here, you'll see, the normal cost stated as a percentage of pay. And you can see, like I said, the horizontal axis shows the age over time. So the point that I was making, that it does spike, it is backloaded because the cost of funding the benefits towards the end of one's career, when their salary is increasing, it starts to grow, so it's backloaded. And also, close to retirement, you'll see the spike, as you can see on the right-hand side of the chart. And a single point on the red line is obviously stable, but as you shift, your demographics could shift, either younger or older by average age. Then you can see that your normal cost would be different. The black line on here, the dotted black line, represents another cost method, which is the entry age normal cost method. And that is spreading the cost evenly from when one enters the plan to when they retire. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that represents a more stable cost method. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk about, what does this conclude in the FE world? But to begin, let me make a comparison between DB and DC plans, defined benefit and defined contribution plans. If you think of total compensation package as the sum of salary and benefits, in terms of a DC plan, the percentage that the employer puts as contribution for the employee each year, that can easily be seen or understood as the benefits piece to it, in additional to salary that they give. In the DB world, the normal cost is usually thought of as the benefit piece that's assigned to that year's cost for the employee. And because we talked about on the previous page that the normal cost under the DB plan grows so large, the financial economics folks actually believe, because it grows so large, that should be the total package, your total compensation, and it should even replace your pay. And there should be no pay increases for your later part of your career, which, this concept is rather extreme. And, GASB, and this is, one of the reasons GASB has concluded that the entry age normal method should be used for financial reporting purposes. So I just want to show you in the appendix, we have page 29 and 30, if Paul can help me jump to slide 29 first. There's in the basis of conclusion portion of GASB, we're not going to read this whole thing here, but this paragraph, specifically 256, talks about the attribution method or cost method. And it starts on this slide. If we go to the next slide, page 30, I just want to highlight a section of this. And it says towards the end, I'm not going to read everything in red, but the key word here is contributing equally towards the end of the last sentence. And that really, when you have time and you can't sleep, you can take a look at this slide. But it basically says that we should be spreading the cost equally, and we shouldn't be backloading. We shouldn't be experiencing a spike in the way that we fund our liabilities. So Paul, I know that you were actually at this task force meeting. Is there anything you want to share with us, or you want to add to this?
I'm trying to get back to slide 13. Let's see if I can do that. There we go. Just real quickly, there was a task force meeting, and the financial economics proponents described how this cost method works. They did a very good job of it, and it was their description of how this works, and the fact that you have this very much backloaded cost that actually would eat up the entire compensation package. I remember when it got to my turn to speak on this point, all I said was, "I hope you heard what the financial economics guy said, because he got it right." And that really was what led to, the more you understand what this method really says, this Tuck method, which is the same as the ABO that we used before, the better you understand it, the more clear it is. It's not an appropriate way to actually allocate cost at a level basis over a career.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sherry.
If we can go over to the next slide, slide 14, I'm going to jump over and switch gears to talk about the discount rate now. So, assuming that your plan is invested in a mix of stocks and bonds, which, most portfolios are these days, this actually is overcharging the current taxpayer if you're using a rate that's lower than what you expect to earn, because, lower discount rate produces higher liabilities, and higher liabilities, you need to fund it more. So if you're using this inflated liability, so to speak, and contributing more to the plan that you're actually earning, then you're essentially violating intergenerational equity. And if the rate of what you're earning is more than what is assumed, then you really aren't letting the members reflect this earning, and it's never realized. So that's an issue. You've earned this money already, but you're not recognizing it through your discount rate and discounting your liabilities. And also in the future, you're not including this expected savings from intergenerational risk sharing. So that is an issue. And GASB, points to that and says that we, should be thinking, if you jump to slide 27, please, Paul. Slide 27 has a lot of words in it again, but, it highlights the fact that it should be a long-term nature. You should be looking at your assets on a long-term nature. And then on slide 28, it does talk about, you should be incorporating these savings taking it into consideration. I'll just highlight a few fragments of the highlighted pieces, the red pieces. It says that you should reasonably anticipate future events that should be incorporated, and the amounts that are projected represents a reduction in the employer's expected sacrifice. So if we go back to 15, I'll continue the discussion here about equity risk and intergenerational risk pooling or sharing. It does entail gains and losses, but on the FE side, it only looks at it from one point of view, and it only looks at the risk of shifting the losses forward. Because of this, FE folks are more of, they're not managing the risk, they're altogether avoiding the risk more so. And this comes at a high price to taxpayers because, again, borrowing words from GASB, they're not reducing the sacrifice, and they're not taking the action to reduce the sacrifice. And it does not balance the costs and benefits of accepting the risk across generations, and thereby, like I said, it's violating intergenerational equity. So on slide 16, what does this conclude in the FE world? The FE principles conclude that pension plans should not invest in equities, even though it's okay on an individual basis, on a DC basis. So the question here is, should retirement plans? How should retirement plans be participating in the economy? Should they do it as an owner through purchasing equity shares in a corporation, or should they be participating via being a lender by purchasing bonds and lending money to organizations? And when this question was thrown at California, it presents an interesting case study, because in 1966, there was an amendment in the state constitution that actually allowed and changed, allowed up to 25% of the portfolio to be invested in equities. And then even later, in 1984, when a prudent man term became popular, made popular by ERISA, there was another state constitution, another change to the state constitution that allowed, you know, of a less cap, like less of a more leeway on how to invest, and you know, as long as it's prudent, you know, it was suffice. And so, you know, if we throw this out there, you know, what kind of conclusion does it bring? You know, investing in equities provides a more economically efficient vehicle for converting taxpayer dollars into retirement securities for public employees. So now that we've discussed the difficulties in applying the FE model to public plans, I'm going to turn over to Paul to talk more about the limitations of the FE model. Paul?
Thanks, Sherry. You know, if we put our math hats on, you know, what actuaries and economists try to do is you have something out in the real world, and you're trying to come up with a mathematical representation of how it's going to behave. And so, you know, the way that you test a model is you look at and see, well, how does the model behave? Well, how do the numbers in the model move around? And do they move around in the same way that you think the thing in the real world would move around? Well, what Sherry just showed us is that certainly in the cost method, the cost that comes out of the financial economics model just doesn't behave the way a level cost would behave, whether for accounting or for funding. Similarly, the discount rate, if you're going to invest in equities, and there are good public policy reasons for doing so, then your costs are not going to be level if you use the low discount rate. So that kind of shows us that there must be something wrong with the financial economic model. And I'll tell you, having been in this debate for 10 years, my gut told me early on that it wasn't behaving right. The model didn't match the way a pension plan behaves, but it took me a while to figure out how it's wrong. And what eventually has become clear is that when you look at the principles that are the basis for the financial economic model, if you read their papers and they list, here are the principles that are necessary for a market pricing model, well, it's just not a complete set of principles. For public agencies, there are principles, objectives, and policy considerations that are simply not included and go beyond those that are reflected in the financial economics model. And it is those additional principles, objectives, and policy considerations that lead to both the level cost allocation method and the use of an expected return discount rate. Those are really the two things that Sherry just went through. Just to repeat, if you look at the GASB statement, which is actually quite well written, it talks about why the level cost is the appropriate cost method for the cost allocation for a public plan, and why the expected return is the appropriate discount rate. Don't think for a minute that GASB was not aware of the market pricing model. They were lobbied very heavily, and they were actually very receptive to considering that. But their conclusions show why, for financial reporting, it just doesn't behave the way a level cost would behave. The same is true for funding. The arguments that GASB uses for measuring the liability, if you read through them back in those slides in the back of this deck, if you substitute funding for financial reporting, you'll find the arguments still hold. You can also look at the white paper, which I mentioned earlier. It talks about a balance between demographic matching, which is sort of the intergenerational equity argument, but also volatility management. You don't want 1 year of taxpayers to pay a much higher or lower cost than the year right after them or right before them. Incorporating that balance, you just cannot find the tools to do that within the financial economics model. So to summarize, the financial economic model and its market value, ABO, accumulated benefit obligation measure, or MVL, if you will, they're simply insufficient to represent the more complicated policy objectives of public pension plans. Actually, going back to that task force meeting in 2009, one of the objections that the financial economics folks raised against using the entry age method, which is the one that Sherry showed, that was that nice horizontal cost, he said it's too complicated. And our response was, you know, a model, it needs to be as complicated as it needs to be to get the job done. So in order to have a level cost, you can't use something as simplistic as just look at the accrued benefit. You have to do something a little more sophisticated. So we will certainly grant that the level cost model is a little more complicated to figure out than the market pricing model, but it is only as complicated as it needs to be to reflect the additional policy objectives that are appropriate for funding a public sector pension plan. This is not a surprise. The financial economics principles, as we said originally, were developed for one reason and one reason only. That is to come up with a value consistent with the financial economic model. That's what they were designed to do. And those principles lead to the market value ABO as the appropriate measure. Now, then the financial economics proponents simply assert not only that those principles are appropriate for other purposes, but that they are sufficient for funding a public pension plan. And in doing so, they don't acknowledge the limitations of the fact that their principles were determined for a particular reason, that is to reproduce market prices. Now, you see how this can be circular? The financial economics proponents, they very carefully show that if you use financial economic principles, you will get a market consistent measure, an MVABO, as the appropriate measure for funding pension plans. Well, but since those principles were developed to reproduce market prices, if you apply financial economic principles to anything, you're going to get a market pricing answer. So if the principles are developed to get a market answer, you can't very well find it convincing, well, if we apply those principles to public pensions, oh, look, we get the market answer. That's because what the principles were designed to do. That doesn't mean that there might not be other policy considerations that lead to a different answer for public sector plans. That's kind of our summary point here. And again, it doesn't break into a soundbite very well. But the idea is that financial economic principles are designed to come up with a market price, and the fact that they lead to a market price for public pension plans, that doesn't tell you something new about public pension plans. It simply confirms what those principles were originally designed to do. We're going to go through, we got a couple more minutes here before we go to questions. I just want to check in with Hank. Do we have a slew of questions waiting there? Because I want to sort of budget our time, because we're now going to talk about some current events as it might apply to how this market value pricing number might be applied to public pension plans.
Well, we have about 4 questions, so that gives you a sense of where we are at this point.
Okay. All right, so I'm not going to go into enormous detail here on what the task force has done. The Actuarial Standards Board, as I said, in 2013, they actually redid ASOP 4 and ASOP 27. Well, that's when they said that the appropriate measure depends on the purpose of the measure. One would have hoped that they would have sort of then left this topic alone for a while, but for a variety of reasons, the Standards Board decided to request information about public pensions. And again, as anyone in this audience knows, public pensions are very much in the headlines today. Not all public plans are funded on an actuarially determined basis, and so some plans have some funding challenges. So the Actuarial Standards Board felt some responsibility there. They did a request for comment, they had a hearing, and they had a task force to summarize all the information they gathered. Well, the task force is basically coming out and saying that what they call a market-based alternative liability measure, that's an MVABO, that's a financial economic type of measure, should be disclosed and calculated for all public pension plans. I described here some of their rationale for doing so. It provides information about risk. They think it might be misleading to only look at the level cost number. And then they say it will help advance the actuarial profession, which basically says that they're to some extent caving into pressure from the financial economic community. The suggestion, these are not in the standards yet at all. I want to stress that. But they have proposed these suggestions that all plans should calculate some proxy for this MVABO. And it would basically be an accrued benefit measure. That's the TUC measure that Sherry talked about, and then a risk-free discount rate, which is basically the rate you would get if you tried to reproduce the accrued benefits using very high-quality fixed income securities and bonds. They also say you should not use the term market value of liabilities. We agree with that part at least. You know, the terminology they're using, they're calling this a solvency measure, which we think is a problem. I'd say if anything, they'd be better off to refer to it as a settlement measure, because that's really what it is. And they say that it's useful as a measure of risk. Sherry touched on this in one of her slides. What this measure does is it tells you what it would cost to avoid the risk altogether by investing in very safe and very low yielding securities. That's not the same as measuring the consequences of risk, which is, I think, what the society should be focusing on. And they actually have another standard coming out that will measure the possible consequences and how to manage risk. But I don't think that this solvency value, this market value liability, really provides information on an ongoing basis on how to manage risk. I say at the bottom here, it quantifies risk aversion, not risk management. And as Sherry pointed out in her section on the discount rate, it is appropriate for the taxpayers to take on equity risk in order to more efficiently provide for reasonable benefits for the people who work for the taxpayers. Now, there's another whole aspect to this, which gets into actuarial politics and economic politics, and that is, even if there are some arguments that there might be some value in having this market pricing type of number available, and again that would be to show a form of risk measure. What we know for sure is that the market pricing proponents are not going to use the MVABO or the MVL. They're not going to use that as a measure of risk. They are going to say that that is the one true measure of pension cost. I have had discussions with these folks where it's pretty clear that they think the only way you can disagree with them is either to be ignorant of their financial economic model or to be basically misbehaving, to be out to deceive the public. The idea that there might be a good faith, mathematically based alternative is not within their scope. Now, there are a lot of these out there. When we were preparing these slides, I just grabbed one that happened to come out. It was online in March 2017. A fellow named David Crane, who actually is a personal friend of mine, works in California. He's a financial economist. He's now allied with Stanford. And in his an online statement, he said, he was talking about how CalPERS, which is the California retirement system, chooses to value liabilities. It says, notice that CalPERS chooses to value its liabilities at the same rate it expects to earn on assets, right? Which, of course, we agree with that statement. We set the discount rate as the expected return on assets. He then says, as Nix had said, it's the lie that gets you. CalPERS lies harm citizens. Quote, by linking the discount rate to investment return assumptions, CalPERS and its sister pension fund CalSTRS are being untruthful. The lies get exposed when citizens get hit with pension deficits. I'm just proposing this as one example of how this market pricing measure will not be represented as an alternative measure. It will be represented as the one true measure. Well, why do actuaries care about this? I often say, only partly tongue-in-cheek, the difference between actuaries and economists is that actuaries operate under a code of professional conduct, and we do. And in our code of conduct, there are precepts, and precept 8 says, I've quoted the whole thing here, an actuary who performs actuarial services shall take reasonable steps to ensure that such services are not used to mislead other parties. And then they say on an annotation that any actuarial communication that may be used by another party in a way to influence the actions of a third party, the actuary should recognize the risks of misquotation, misinterpretation, and other misuse, and should take reasonable steps to present the actuarial communication clearly and fairly, and to include appropriate limitations on the distribution utilization of the actuarial communication. And what we're told is that if we are required to publish this market value liability, that we should then include appropriate limitations and say, for example, that this is not the basis for funding, but rather this is simply a measure of the amount of riskiness in the plan's assets. I've heard that argument very often lately. Well, just a moment. What if no amount of clearly presented limitations on utilization? What if no amount of qualifiers put around this number will prevent the solvency value or the settlement value from being misinterpreted to other parties as the true cost of the benefit? So this could put an actuary in a bind, like myself and Sherry in a bind. If the standard of practice says you should publish a number, and we know that that number is going to be used to mislead the public because it will be represented as the true cost of the benefit rather than as a risk-free cost, what are we to do? Do we comply with the standard, or do we comply with the code of conduct? Stay tuned, because I think if the standards board does come out with a proposed change in the standard to require this disclosure, I think public sector actuaries around the country are going to have to deal with that very particular question. So just to summarize, now I do want to say something to all you pension trustees out there. There's a lot of discussion about lowering the expected return, which is what we use as the discount rate. Public plans used to all use 8%. Now in California, we have quite a number of plans that are at 7%, and I don't think we have any plans that are above 7.25%, maybe 1 or 2. And I think the rest of the country is following that trend. Well, when someone comes to you and says you need to lower your discount rate, remember there are two very different arguments for lowering the discount rate. If the guy is a financial economist, he'll say you should lower your discount rate because you're basing it on expected returns, and you shouldn't be doing that. You should be basing it on the market settlement price. We reject that argument. That's what we've been doing for the last hour here. However, if the person comes in and says, I agree that you should be using your expected return as your discount rate, I agree with the level cost model, but I think your expected return is just overly optimistic, that's a conversation you have to have. That is an essential part of any review of assumptions. So again, whenever someone, when I meet somebody in a bar to find I'm a public pension actuary, and they go, oh, you guys are using discount rates that are too high, I ask them, why do you say that? And if it's because they think we should be ignoring the assets and using the risk-free yield curve, I tell them pound sand. But if they say you need to be more realistic about what the assets can actually earn, then we'll order drinks and we'll talk about it. So arguments for lower discount rate often confuse the two, and you need to be very clear. Are we talking about a more conservative expected earnings? Or are we talking about valuing the pensions like low risk bonds? We'll close our remarks here. Just go back to these two sources. I strongly recommend these to your attention. The top one here will basically give you a review of what we've discussed today. It was originally written for the American Enterprise Institute, who were definitely on the financial economics side, and then it was reprinted in 2016. And there's a link there. And then this, when we talk about how to fund the plan, all the time we spend talking about financial economics, I think we should be talking about perfecting the level cost model for you plans that are funded on an actually determined basis. If you haven't looked at this actuarial white paper on funding policy, I'd recommend that to your attention. So Hank, we got about 6 minutes here. You want to hit us with a couple questions? Or actually, Sherry, anything you want to say in closing before we throw it over to Hank?
No, you did a great job. I think I'll turn it over to Hank to let us know what the questions are.
Great. Well, first, Sherry, Paul, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. So let me start off with one of the first questions we got, which is, what is the best way to get annual benefit payment projections and expected payment projections?
Sherry, you want to take a run at that? It's pretty straight up, I think.
You can take a stab at it and I'll add to it.
Okay. I mean, your plan has, a lot of the benefit projections are really based on demographics. And so what you should do is have up-to-date demographic assumptions. And that means you have to do what's called an experience analysis on a regular basis. Here in California, we do them every 3 years. I don't think you need to do many more than that, but I would say every 3 to 5 years, you need to review all of your assumptions. How long are people going to live? How long are they going to work? What age are they going to retire? What age are they going to become disabled? If you have good demographic assumptions, then you can pretty easily project the future benefit cash flow. That's actually not that difficult to do. Then turning it into a value today, that's where the expected return discount rate comes in. And there again, you got to watch out for just because you're used to having a discount rate, expected return of 8%, doesn't mean that is still supportable in today's environment. So you have to have a realistic expected return. But projecting the benefits is actually fairly straightforward once you have up-to-date demographic assumptions.
Right. And,
sure.
you know, the discount rate really is the piece that you focus on, because once you start projecting the benefit payments, that's outside the focus of the cost allocation method. So, you know, I think the most important piece is to really use a discount rate that's reflective of what your assets are earning.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Next question is, if a city has a negative net worth, should the assumptions be handled differently?
Boy, you know, I have the luxury of not being in that situation. Again, negative net worth could simply be because of the way GASB measures the liabilities. Now, we've skipped over a tricky part here. If you are funding your plan on an actuarially determined basis, so you're projected to have enough contributions and assets to pay the benefits, then the GASB discount rate is the expected return. But for some plans that are not doing that, the GASB rules require to use a mixture of the risk-free rate and the expected return. That can make your liabilities bigger, and that can make the plan, at least on a balance sheet basis, appear to have a negative net worth. In my heart, I don't think that changes your assumptions, because after all, the plan assets are going to earn what they're going to earn. People are going to live as long as they're going to live, and they're going to work as long as they're going to work. And so, you know, I like to say that the plan assets don't know what the sponsor's balance sheet condition is. So I'm not sure that you change your assumptions, but I'm a little bit ivory tower on that. Sherry, do you have a more maybe real world view of that?
Well, you know, I would say the big question is, when do you need the money by? You know, if it's negative net worth, you know, does that mean bankruptcy? Does it mean that you need to, you know, settle with your participants and pay out the money right now? Or do you have the luxury of you know, funding it and amortizing it over the future years? And that, you know, and I think that would present a question, and the answer would follow of, you know, what Paul mentioned, you know, what tool do you use? Is it the hammer or is it the saw? You know, what are you trying to get at? And if you're trying to get at a more short-term settlement value, then you might have to look at the term of your investment assets. Is it shorter term or is it longer term? And if it's a shorter term, then obviously you don't have the luxury of using a longer term rate. But, you know, negative net worth, is it, you know, do you still have the luxury, like I said, if the plan closes and you still have time to fund it, you know, amortize it over future years, then you have a longer time horizon to work with. And in that case, it would be a different discount rate.
Yeah, agreed. You know, Hank, part of this, the question is a little bit tricky, because when you say negative net worth, is that just on an accounting basis, or are we actually looking at an employer that might be going insolvent? Those are very different. I was talking mainly if it's just an accounting issue, I don't think it's an issue. But if you actually have a plan that an employer that might go insolvent, then you may be looking at more of a settlement rate, which would move would move in the direction of the financial economic measure.
Great, thank you. So, Paul, as you were answering the previous question, you mentioned, just supposed ivory tower and real world, and I guess the next question somewhat falls on that, which is there seems to be a splitting of the world between sort of the academics and the practitioners of the public plan space relative to whether they advocate for financial economics or, you know, the more traditional model. Is there anything to that?
Well, I think there's a great deal of truth to that. I think a lot of the financial economists are really from an academic standpoint. I don't know that they've really looked at the real world consequences of their model. Now, financial economists fall into various schools. There are some who really just want to get rid of defined benefit plans, quite frankly. And they use this, they want to overstate the liabilities to make the plans more politically vulnerable. But there are also, within the financial economic community, folks who believe in defined benefit plans, just think that we should be running them on a different basis. But I do think it's somewhat academic. Now, although also even in the level cost space where I live, I think that plans should use a realistic discount rate and should use reasonable funding methods. And in some cases, that produces much higher current costs. Does that mean I'm not politically realistic? So you can almost be, even within the level cost crowd, we can be accused of not being realpolitik about where are these funds going to come from. But I think you have to run the level cost model wherever it takes you. But short answer, Hank, I think there is some academic spin to the financial economic viewpoint. I would agree.
And last question, I think it's more towards you, Sherry. In terms of New York City, are you facing real pressures regarding financial economics versus the traditional model?
Well, there's always going to be political pressure left and right of where to take the assumptions and the discount rate. But, in New York City, we are using a 7% discount rate, which I would say mirrors our assets pretty well. And we are using an entry age normal cost method that is also written into the state constitution. So, there is always pressure to lower the discount rate, but I don't think any organization or any jurisdiction is going to be immune to that.
Well, let me conclude by thanking both Sherry Chan and Paul Angelo for this wonderful session on financial economics. At the conclusion of this webinar, there will be 4 short survey questions that we ask all participants to answer. And again, thank you, and we look forward to for your attendance at the next NCPERS webinar. Thank you all.